In part 2, we added some animation to the live super. Now in part 3, let's jazz it up with some animating flares and looping highlights. So let's start with the effect in. In the browser, there is a bitmap that looks like a red lens flare. With the effect in selected, double-click on the bitmap to add it to the scene. When we turn Global Keyframe Tool button off, we can move this object around without creating any keyframes. Slide the animation down to the correct time and now move the bitmap into place. And you can see no keyframe was added. Rotate it and position it higher in the Z space. In addition to resizing it, let's go over to the rendering properties and turn on the additive blending. This will now blend the colors of the lens flare with anything that is underneath, giving it a more realistic look during the animation. Now rewind the animation to the beginning and turn the Global Keyframe Tool button back on so we can add some additional keyframes. In addition, I'm going to extend the timeline of this object down to about 2 seconds by just left-clicking the mouse and dragging the end. Advance the time marker and give the flare some rotation, which automatically adds a keyframe. Now back at the start, we'll also scale it down and then make it transparent by setting the surface properties to 0. Now move it up to about the midpoint of the animation. Turn the surface property back up to 100% and scale it bigger. Go to the end keyframe and bring the surface back down to 0. Now as I scrub through the animation, the flare gets brighter and bigger as it rotates and then finally fades off. When I added this bitmap to the effect in, it automatically appears in the default timeline tab as well, but the transparency is automatically set to 0. I could have added it first to the default tab, then made it transparent, and then added it to the effect in and did the animation. But by adding it to the effect in first, a few less steps were required. Now the next thing I want to add is a flare that animates over the surface properties of the red bar and keeps looping. We'll do this in the default timeline tab. We added a couple of textures to the surface of the 3D primitive to give it this look. I can add a third bitmap as a texture and animate it, but I want a little more flexibility. So let's copy and paste the red bar in the scene graph. Now move it back into the group just above the red bar and rename it Red Bar Flare. Delete the 2 bitmaps that were textures and make the color white. Raise it up in the Z position ever so slightly to show that it is covering the red bar. Okay, now let's find an orange flare and drop it onto the surface of the new 3D bar. Make sure the mapping is set to clamp. If it is set to repeat, the flare will keep repeating as it moves across the surface, and that is not the repeating that I want. Now go back to the rendering properties and also change the blending to additive. Finally, extend the time of this object out to about 6 seconds. For this animation, we are going to animate it on the surface properties and not using the XYZ properties. Notice that I'm also going to do the animation inside of this group and in the default timeline tab. When you create animations inside a group on the default timeline tab, they just keep animating unless you add those single objects to another timeline tab. The key is to add the animations into the group and then add the group to a timeline tab and create the animation on the group. At the beginning of the animation, let's move the flare off to the left. Now move up to about the 4-second mark and move the flare to the right, which automatically creates a keyframe. Okay, to keep the flare repeating, let's go to the transition properties and check loop. This is a great feature because it allows you to loop any object in the scene graph individually. So this one is set to 6 seconds, which will animate the flare across the object in 4 seconds, and then 2 seconds later will repeat. You can also have another object looping at a different time completely. You can build as many objects as you want, all looping individually at their own set time. So now let's see how this animation looks. Click the play button. It animates onto the screen and you see the flare moving across the red bar and looping every 6 seconds. If I click the default timeline tab, The flare keeps animating because that is where we created the animation. Now let's do two more things to this message. First, I want to make this message persistent so that we can add more messages to the scene while the live is on the output. Simply check this box labeled persistent, and now when I play it to air, it will stay on the output when I add another message like a lower third. This little blue infinity symbol tells the user this message is persistent. The last thing I want to do is give the message a hotkey to effect it off the output. Because it is persistent and a normal transfer from the keyboard will not lose the live super, which is what you want, you might want to add a lower third name super to the scene while the live is already on the output, and then lose the lower third name super, leaving the live super. So by selecting the Effect Out Timeline tab and going to the Transition Properties, there is a Transition Hotkey Assignments area. Click the Configuration button and assign it any key as the hotkey. In my case, I'm going to assign the Shift plus F10 key combination. Now let's play this message, and when I press the Shift plus the F10 key, this message will perform the effect out. In part 4, we are going to apply some conditional transitions to the message to give it even more flexibility.